Sandra Motz, and I work at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and I am the Lower Willamette Basin Coordinator. So I work with a lot of cities and counties, and now water conveyance districts in the lower part of the basin. Priscilla.
Hi, I'm Priscilla Wolverton, and I work as a basin coordinator at the opposite end of the basin from Andrea. So I'm down in the southern Willamette Valley in the upper part of the watershed. And I also work with designated management agencies and now a handful of water conveyance entities in Tmdl implementation.
Next, we're going to hand it over to Zach Lowboy. Zach is the Western Region's Watershed Manager to give some opening remarks. Zach?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Glad that you could all attend. So again, my name is Zach Lowboy. I manage the Western Region Watersheds and Stormwater team. One of the people that works for me is Priscilla Wolverton, who just introduced herself. There's another manager that works out of our Northwest Region office, Steve Mrazek, who also manages Tmdl and non-point source program staff. Steve's not with us today, but Steve Mrazek and I both really appreciate your participation in this workshop today. This is a workshop that's specifically geared towards water conveyance entities named as responsible persons in the Willamette Mercury Tmdl. This is the last of 5 workshops that we've held, and it's geared towards specific Tmdl implementation requirements for the Mercury Tmdl. Previous workshops were focused on cities and counties, many of which had been implementing Tmdls for a long time. Some of those entities doing that for almost 20 years. So this is the most populous basin in the state, and there's numerous agencies and jurisdictions who will be working towards reducing mercury to Oregon's waterways so that people can safely consume fish and shellfish. So although we acknowledge some DMAs and responsible persons have a greater or sometimes lesser impact on mercury reduction, it will take a group effort to achieve these goals, and we want to just acknowledge that up front. We know it will take a lot of years to reduce mercury, so the collective incremental efforts of reducing runoff and erosion containing mercury will make a difference over time. There are 45 water conveyance entities named as responsible persons in the Willamette Basin Mercury Tmdl. Actions implemented by that group will be an important component of reducing mercury erosion and sediment from entering our rivers and streams. So participants on the call today are mostly new to Tmdl implementation. We recognize that, and because of that, our basin coordinators like Priscilla and Andrea, but we have others, they're prepared to help you out, assist you in navigating a program that you're likely not familiar with. These Willamette Basin coordinators will be working closely with all of you to answer questions you may have as you are designated a responsible person within the Tmdl. So each has been assigned to a specific basin coordinator. So all the responsible persons, as noted in the Tmdl, have been assigned a specific basin coordinator. The letter you received from us back in March includes the name of the basin coordinator assigned to your jurisdiction. So even though all of those folks are going to be trying to reach out to you as the point of contact, there are lots of designated management agencies or responsible persons within this Tmdl. So it's really important that you proactively reach out to your basin coordinator if you don't hear from them. So please make sure that those clear lines of communication are established. So like I said, there's a lot of DMAs, there's a lot of responsible persons assigned, and there's actually 172. So that's a bunch. Let's see. The Tmdl program also, it's a regulatory program. DEQ is a regulatory agency. This is another regulatory program. We have enforcement capabilities related to approving Tmdl implementation plans and their updates that are every 5 years. as well as receiving timely annual reports and assessing progress. So in turn, the basin coordinators will ensure that the responsible persons are aware of any implementation plan and reporting requirements and expectations for successful TMDL implementation plan development. And so it's really meant to be a collaborative approach to try to help and assist to make those implementation plans as good as they can be, but also make them implementable. The non-point source implementation requirements for water conveyance entities are a little different compared to the requirements for other DMAs. The measures developed for the responsible persons represent the unique systems you manage and have jurisdiction to regulate. So we want to acknowledge that there is a little bit of a difference, and we know that there's quite a difference between a large municipality and a water conveyance district. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea and Priscilla, who are going to lead the rest of the way through this workshop, which hopefully will give you a great overview of the non-point source requirements related to designated management agencies and responsible persons that are water conveyance entities. So thank you again so much this morning for tuning in, and thank you for attending. And with that, I'll turn it over to, I think, Andrea.
It is me. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and kick off this presentation. So some of you may have tuned into our very first workshop, and that workshop was geared towards new designated management agencies and responsible persons, as well as an introduction to the TMDL program. So if any of you made it to that meeting, I think that was probably just a really great introduction into this program and what it means to be a responsible person. If you weren't able to attend that, all these presentations are posted to our website, and we also recorded that particular presentation. So 2 of the presentations we have recorded, so please look to our website to take a look at that presentation. For those of you that did see that presentation, I am going to have some similar slides around the Mercury TMDL, and that was just to provide some introductory types of material. So if you did already see that, you'll see some of these slides again, but it's probably worth repeating again here. So our learning objectives today, I am going to cover, a summary of the revised Mercury TMDL and talk a little bit about EPA's percent mercury reductions that are applicable to the water conveyance entities. And then we'll have a break for questions. And then after that break, Priscilla will take over and talk more about the actions related to TMDL reporting and tracking, and also talk about some of the requirements for the water conveyance entities and some of the best management practices and strategies that they will likely be implementing. Here's the Mercury TMDL timeline. So it began our update in December 2017. So we had a Mercury TMDL that was in place in 2006. But in 2011, the state adopted a new Mercury standard for the state that applied, and that was much more stringent. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. But it was more stringent, and because of that and some other reasons, we did need to update the Mercury TMDL. So we started that process back in December of 2017, and we had a number of advisory committee meetings. Those ended in June of 2019, and then towards the end of 2019, DEQ issued our TMDL. That TMDL, however, was disapproved by EPA, and that was because EPA believed that the percent point source and non-point source allocations that DEQ's TMDL had allocated across the entire basin would not be protective at each of the subbasin levels. So EPA developed allocations for each of the 12 subbasins. So that's really the major difference between the two TMDLs. So when EPA developed it, they developed it the following month in December. It did go out for public comment, and there were some delays associated with EPA's issuing the final TMDL, and part of that was administration change. They issued their final TMDL this February. So that TMDL that was issued in February is the final TMDL. And you can find that TMDL on DEQ's website. So we have that TMDL along with all the other documents associated with this TMDL. So mercury in the environment. Mercury is a naturally occurring element, and it does persist in the environment, and it becomes more toxic to humans when it's converted into the organic form. So when it's methylated, it becomes methylmercury, and that can happen through various kinds of microbial processes in the water and in the sediment. So once it's converted to methylmercury, that's the form that accumulates in humans and fish. And so that is the form that is most toxic to humans. So for example, fish, fish that eat other fish, they will tend to accumulate more mercury, and older fish tend to accumulate more mercury than, say, younger fish. Non-resident fish like salmon and steelhead that spend most of their life cycle feeding in the ocean tend to have lower concentrations of mercury in their system. So why are greater reductions of mercury necessary? So as I mentioned, in 2011, Oregon adopted a more protective fish tissue criterion. So this fish and shellfish criterion is unique in Oregon in that it's the only standard that we have where the concentration is measured actually in the fish tissue. And that's because that's the primary route of exposure for humans. It's through eating fish. So that is where the standard lays, is within the fish tissue concentration. And that protects Oregonians for being able to consume up to 23 8-ounce servings of fish per month. And that's fish caught in Oregon's water. This consumption level is about 8 times more stringent than what it was in 2006. So in that first TMDL, and again, that was why we had to, one of the reasons why we had to update the mercury TMDL. There's also a second criterion to meet, and that's the total mercury criterion measured in the water column, so in the stream or water body, and that's to protect for aquatic life. That's just fish and shellfish. To meet these very protective standards, large reductions of mercury are needed across the entire Willamette Basin. So just providing an overall framework here, most of the mercury coming into the state does come from air deposition from sources outside Oregon. And then it moves from the land and water bodies, through erosion and runoff. So dissolved mercury can be found in runoff as well. These sources come from, national and global sources, through burning, incinerators, can come through different coal-fired power plants, natural sources such as forest fires and volcanic eruptions. There are some sources in Oregon through air emissions, and then we also have some historical sources of mercury from gold mining that occurred, many years ago, where they used mercury to extract gold. And so you can still find mercury in those spoils in some of those old mercury sites. So our primary strategy in the water quality management plan is for the DMAs and RPs to reduce erosion or runoff to water bodies. So although it's very difficult to control mercury coming into the state, what we can do as land managers is reduce the occurrence of erosion and runoff into water bodies as much as we can. And as I said, there's very large reductions to make. EPA's Tmdl is, the reductions are based on the subbasin level. So it is between 88 and 96% reductions are needed across the basins for mercury. So there's large reductions to make. And we know this is not going to occur within, 10 years. They're talking, 50 years or so down the line for these reductions to occur. That being said, we have had in the past actions at the state level to reduce mercury. Our biggest source of mercury emissions in the state was from the PGE power plant outside of Boardman, and that closed in 2020. In 2019, the state of Oregon joined 20 other states in a lawsuit against EPA's decision at the national level to ease restrictions on coal-fired power plants. And it's also worth noting here that EPA is a designated management agency for this Tmdl. So they are required to develop an implementation plan and report out on those actions that they are responsible for. So that could involve different Superfund sites across the Willamette Basin where mercury reductions could be occurring, and also as well at the national and potentially global levels for reducing mercury. So they are also on the hook to reduce mercury through their regulatory processes as well. We've also had various state bans, restrictions, and then just management of products containing mercury, as you see in thermostats, vehicle switches, lighting fixtures. And in 2007, the legislature required dental offices to install dental amalgam separators. As many of you know, those fillings that they put in our teeth do contain metals, including mercury. And the addition of the amalgam separators at the dental offices definitely reduced the amount of mercury going into wastewater treatment plants. Because once mercury gets to wastewater treatment plants, it can be very difficult to remove. So here are some of the efforts that the state has done to reduce mercury where we can. This slide is kind of the you're not alone slide. So this is the list of the 172 designated management agencies and responsible persons that are responsible for reducing mercury in the Willamette Basin. As Zach said in the very beginning, the Willamette Basin is the most populous basin in the state. A lot of cities with special districts, water conveyance entities. We've identified 45 of them. So there are a lot of different agencies working towards reducing mercury across the basin. One thing to note here is that the number of DMAs don't necessarily equate to the significance of mercury. So for example, it shows here, there's 6 federal agencies that are DMAs for the Tmdl. So even though there's only 6 federal agencies, their land ownership across the Willamette Basin is quite large, so they can be significant. Here's a slide here because we've gotten some questions about, what's the difference between the Oregon Department of Ag authority versus what the water conveyance entity roles are. So we wanted to have a slide on this. So the Ag Water Quality Management Act does give authority to ODA to adopt and enforce rules that protect water quality from different farm practices. And here are just some examples of different farm practices. It doesn't, though, include management of water conveyance systems. Oops. That's considered more of an agricultural service, so to speak, so it doesn't include management of these systems. So the water conveyance systems are responsible for quality of the water through various operation and maintenance of the canal work and the ditches and the return flows to water bodies. For ODA, the water quality protection from farm practices are accomplished through agricultural water quality management plans and rules. And DEQ and ODA have a process set up. We work together to review some of those plans. So that is a process that we have used for quite some time with our sister agency. And SWCDs continue to play a critical role in providing technical assistance and resources to landowners. One thing I do want to note here, so even though water conveyance systems, so they don't have responsibility for the quality of water that they receive from producers, from landowners. But it doesn't prohibit them from identifying cases where they see issues coming into their water conveyance system. So if they see or have identified issues, sediment coming into the ditches, and whether it's from producer land, or they can work with Oregon Department of Agriculture, sometimes it's city discharge, it doesn't preclude them from reaching out and collaboratively working with those other people to try and reduce that source of pollution. So I just have a couple more slides here, just noting with EPA's disapproval of the Tmdl. And I've already basically said this, but so EPA's Tmdl, they develop non-point source and point source pollutant allocations by subbasin. So you do need to look to their Tmdl to see what those non-point source and point source pollutant allocations are by source and subbasin. And so they have some nice tables in their Tmdl that clearly points out what the allocations that are applicable. EPA's Tmdl did state, though, that reasonable assurance for their Tmdl continues to rely on DEQ's water quality management plan. The DEQ's water quality management plan, which is combined with the Tmdl, that continues to apply. So you can still look at the water quality management plan for those required management actions. Just to look, but you need to look to EPA's Tmdl to see what those allocations are applicable to each subbasin. So again, effective allocations equals EPA's Tmdl, effective management measures equals DEQ's water quality management plan. And these are the allocations, EPA's allocations that apply to water conveyance entities. These come from sources, runoff, sediment from agricultural lands, forested lands, shrub, grassland, pasture hay areas. The responsible DMAs that manage those sources include ODA, the Oregon Department of Forestry, the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Rec, and there's also a number of other state and federal agencies, and also includes then the irrigation and drainage districts as well. So those total mercury reductions that apply are either it's between 88 or 97% reductions, and that again depends on the subbasin that you're located in, your district is located in. Another thing to note is that these are aggregated allocations. So not each one of these DMAs or responsible persons are responsible for meeting that 88 to 97% reduction. It means that together, these DMAs and responsible persons in each of those subbasins work together to meet those load allocations. So we are going to pause here for a break before we move on to Priscilla's part of the presentation. I don't know if we have any questions in the chat or. I
I'm
don't know
not,
if
I'm not seeing any questions yet,
Okay.
but I'll remind folks, there's a couple ways that you can ask questions. You can post your questions in the chat, as Andrea said. You can use the reactions button to raise your hand, and we have one hand raised, and then also you can email me, and my email there is posted in the chat. So we have one question from Bobby, and Bobby, I will ask you to unmute so you can ask your question.
Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, so I have a question. I guess there's a few questions. I'm kind of seeing how we're trying to fit all DMAs in one box, so to speak. And there's not one box that we should all fit in, basically. When you talk about O&M on canals and eliminating erosion, we don't have canals. We're 65% pressurized pipeline, and the water comes from a high quality source. So the influence we have on mercury inputs into water bodies, in my opinion, is fairly small. Secondly, we also have a very small staff. We have access to easements, but we don't have access to the property, the whole properties of where the drainage occurs. So in that sense, I feel like that would be more of a drainage district or soil and water conservation issue. Whereas I don't feel like we are in a position to police or mitigate. I mean, it's much to our ability, but like I said, we're 65% pipeline, very efficient, and the water quality is high to begin with. So I don't know how much reduction we could do, and we are limited staff wise. So there are some complications, and it just seems kind of a big ask to put everyone in the same box. So how are you dealing with the differences between entities that contribute more to the mercury than others?
No, that's a good question, Bobby. And, actually Priscilla's going to be going through in her part of the presentation some of the considerations that we look at. And you're right, not every water conveyance system is the same. They have different, water sources, and how they transport water through the system could be different, which it sounds like it is for you. And so we'll be considering all of that as we consider of whether, the system needs to develop an implementation plan. So, Priscilla will go through some of that. I think you had a question about like ditch management on private lands. I think that's what you were getting at. And you would only have control over what the system owns and operates. So any of the laterals coming into your system would be under the responsibility of the landowner. So you wouldn't be responsible for that. Only the part of the conveyance system that you own or operate.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrea. Are there any other questions? If not, we'll just continue forward, and I'll remind everybody that we will have another opportunity for questions and answers after Priscilla's presentation. So not seeing anything, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Priscilla.
Great, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Looking good.
Great. So how does the Mercury Tmdl affect water conveyance systems? Andrew's already touched on this, but just to kind of transition here to the next part of the presentation. The reason you're on the call today is because you were identified as a responsible person in the Mercury Tmdl Water Quality Management Plan. And all responsible persons that manage or operate a system are required to implement the Tmdl where applicable. And where applicable means it points to what Andrea just spoke to, that part of the system that you own and operate and manage. So what is Tmdl implementation? Again, for you, that means implementing erosion and sediment controls only for that part of the system that you have authority or jurisdiction to operate and manage. And the expectation is that you'll use best management practices to operate and perform maintenance on your system. For a lot of you, this probably means not doing anything much different than you already are, other than documenting that and sharing that information with DEQ. And just a reminder that this also includes the responsibility to follow any other state and local requirements that you may have regarding the operation and maintenance of your system. So one of the things that all responsible persons named in the TMDL will need to do is submit a map of your system where it exists on the landscape, as well as a primary point of contact information for DEQ. During TMDL development, we did reach out to all of the water conveyance entities a couple times, asking for you to contact us because we did have very little information about you. And so unfortunately, we only heard from a couple different entities. And so going into this, we had to use the information that we had available, which was limited. And we may find in talking to you that maybe 100% of your system is piped. And in that type of scenario, your implementation requirements will be very few. But that's not information we have for most of you at this point. So to start out with, it's really important that we get a map of your system and someone we can call or email to follow up with questions. The other expectation for implementation is that you're going to use BMPs to operate and maintain your system. And this list here is just a few that are already commonly practiced. Managing flow and drainage to reduce erosion and sediment, using canal and stream bank stabilization practices, as well as maintaining a current map of the system. And this is just an example of the type of BMPs that we're talking about. On the left, we see a system that does need some vegetation maintenance. This maybe is too overgrown to serve the purpose of the system. But on the right, we see a completely denuded area that is now highly susceptible to erosion and sediment movement. And so there should be some in between these two illustrations that we can aim for so that we can meet those very high reductions over time in sediment, which carries mercury into our systems. So what is implementation tracking and reporting? So this is something that's very familiar to the DMAs that we've been working with, the cities and counties and other state and federal agencies. But this will be new for almost all, if not all, of the water conveyance systems that were named in the Mercury TMDL. And what you're going to be required to do is develop an implementation plan and report to DEQ about your implementation activities. However, like Andrea spoke to earlier, what that looks like for your specific conveyance system may be very different compared to others. And we're going to figure out what is appropriate for your system based on a questionnaire that we've developed. And this is a questionnaire that we can share with you. If you haven't already reached out to your basin coordinator, please do that. We can send you this questionnaire and you can look through it and see the types of information we're going to use to determine what your implementation tracking and reporting requirements are going to be. And I'm going to walk you through just a few of the questions that are in this questionnaire. We won't go through the entire questionnaire. There's a number of questions in it, but I do want to go over some of the first few. So the most important question is, does your system discharge or have return flows to waters of the state? And this is where, we will take into consideration whether your system is fully piped from the point of diversion. And if it is, it's unlikely that you would have tracking and reporting requirements. Now, if your system is only partially piped and you do have maintained canals, open ditch canals, then you probably will have some tracking and reporting requirements. But if you have a fully piped system, that's information you definitely want to let us know. Is the system registered as a special district or nonprofit? What this indicates is that you have potentially a governing board that makes decisions about how the system is operated and maintained. And it also indicates whether you're supported by water users. And if it is, there may be an outreach and education component that we request in your implementation tracking and reporting. Do you actively operate and maintain your system? This is something that we've learned can be highly variable between different systems, especially depending on the size and how it's governed, who's making decisions about the maintenance of the system. But we do want to know how you manage for vegetation. When you, if and when you dredge, do you do that when water is low? Are you doing that during times when the canal is full? What type of maintenance are you performing on the infrastructure? And other types of information that you have about how you maintain and perform maintenance on the system. One of the things we're also going to ask is what guidance or documentation or what process do you use to manage and operate your system? Do you have something in writing? If you do, what you already have in writing, you may be able to submit as your implementation plan, or may be able to just reorganize in like a Word document and submit that as your implementation plan. The uplift on the information you provide to DEQ may be fairly small if you already have maintenance or guidance documents or operation and maintenance manuals in place that you follow to perform maintenance on your system. And these are just a few of the management strategies that we will be asking you about in our one-on-one conversations with you. What kind of turbidity or sediment best management practices are you already using? Let's document those. You may already be doing what you need to do, and we just need to document that. Also want to see that you know which of the activities you perform require state and federal permits or ODF and W approval. That's information that you should have documented, and you should know which of the activities you perform require permits or permissions from other state and federal agencies. And if that's information you don't have, we can help you find that and make sure that we document that with you. We also want to know about your stream bank and canal stabilization practices, including non-structural BMPs, and how you may manage your upland infrastructure like roads and pumps. Some additional management strategies that we'll want to talk to you about. If you have water users, do you have a newsletter or a website where you provide helpful information to them about how they may impact the maintenance of the system? Do you monitor and evaluate the best management practices that you employ? Again, how do you manage flow and drainage to reduce runoff and erosion? And do you perform maintenance on a schedule? Do you have ditch riders that go out and perform these things as needed when through visual inspections? Or are you working on a specific schedule that you adhere to? And again, maintaining that current map of your system is important. And that's something that we want to have on file. We want to know where these systems exist on the landscape. And again, this is something we had asked for in Tmdl development, but unfortunately, we did not receive from most entities except from a couple. But it was helpful because there were a couple entities that were able to show us, you know, they had a fully piped system from the point of diversion to the point of discharge. And we were actually able to remove them from the TMDL because of that information they provided. At this point, everyone who's in the TMDL is a responsible person. So moving forward, you know, we will have to work with you to go through this questionnaire and determine your tracking and reporting requirements. So what exactly is an implementation plan? Well, this is an example. This is an excerpt from an implementation plan. As some of you may know, in the Rogue Basin, drainage and irrigation districts have been implementing the TMDL since 2008. So the districts down there have a lot of experience in implementing TMDLs. And this is an example from an implementation plan an implementation plan of a district I worked with in the Rogue Basin, except for the parameter, which I updated to be specific to this group. But an implementation plan can be as simple as a table, which just shows the parameter that we're addressing, in this case, mercury via sediment, the source of that sediment, and the best management practice or the activity that the district will use or the water conveyance entity will use to reduce the sediment coming from that source. Exactly what those actions look like, and then a measure for tracking whether or not those actions are implemented. So an implementation plan doesn't have to be an 80-page document. It really can be condensed into a fairly simple table with column headers that look like this. So this is the timeline. Andrea shared with you earlier the timeline that applied during development up to TMDL approval. This is our timeline from the date that you received that letter in March moving forward. So in March, you received a letter. It was DEQ saying, hey, you're a responsible person in the TMDL, Mercury TMDL Water Quality Management Plan. And the date of this letter starts an 18-month time frame. And in the next 18 months from the date of that letter is that opportunity to work one-on-one with your basin coordinator to submit the implementation plan that you're required to submit. It's really important that you work with your basin coordinator between now and September 3rd, 2022, which is the due date of these plans, to make sure that any and all required documentation on your end is submitted and ready for review and approval by DEQ. So still plenty of time to work with your basin coordinator. But like Zach mentioned prior to the presentation, we are working with a lot of different DMAs and responsible persons. So it's important that you get a hold. If you haven't heard from us, reach out to us, get a hold of us sooner than later so we can start the ball rolling on walking you through that questionnaire and determining what type of implementation planning and reporting you're going to be responsible for. And again, as we go through that questionnaire, we may find that there's very little that we need to document for your system, depending on where and how your system exists on the landscape. So a part of implementation tracking and reporting includes annual reports. Not everyone will be required to submit an annual report. Again, this is something that we'll determine by going through that questionnaire to get more information from you. Those that are required to submit an annual report, basically what that is giving a status update on each of those actions that we looked at in that table a few minutes ago for that previous year. It's just telling us, did you do the thing you said you were going to do? And if not, tell us why not. Were there challenges in implementing these actions or was there some progress made? And your annual report is submitted to and reviewed by your basin coordinator. So the same person that's going to work with you on going through that questionnaire and helping you develop an implementation plan if you need one, that's the same person that's going to be reviewing your report. So you're always going to have that one point of contact for continuity and consistency. And this is just a reminder, Zach mentioned this before the presentation as well. You know, we are a regulatory agency. We prefer to provide technical assistance and work with you beforehand to help make sure that you have everything you need to have in place to be in compliance. That's our first goal. But this is just a reminder that if you don't submit the information that's required and that we've asked for, you know, we can and at times do move into enforcement. But again, we'd prefer to work with you ahead of this becoming an issue. And so if you ever have any challenges or questions or concerns about implementing your plan, developing the plan, submitting reports, contact us and we will work with you to try and help keep you in compliance. The letters you received all identified your point of contact, your basin coordinator. This is the list of all of the Willamette basin coordinators. Again, you've been assigned a specific point of contact. If you've lost that letter or you don't remember who your contact is, you can contact any one of us and we will get you to the right place. And with that, we'll end this presentation and we'll open the floor up for more questions.
Great, thank you, Priscilla. Again, I want to remind folks you can post your questions in the chat window. You can use the reactions button to raise your hand, and you can email me questions. My email is listed above. We do have a comment here from Ellen Hammond at ODA. And Ellen, I wanted to give you a chance to share your comment or expand on that at all.
Sure. So Department of Agriculture has been given authority to validate notices for certain channels that would otherwise require a DSL permit. And I just noticed in the management strategies slides, there was a discussion about permits, if you know all the permits you need. And I believe it said something about ODF and W. I can't remember quite the wording, ODF and W approval or something. But I just wanted to make sure you all were aware that there's this new program through ODA that simplifies the process, again, for eligible channels to do channel maintenance work without having to go through the more arduous and costly process of getting a permit through DSL. And that program is administered jointly with DSL and Department of Fish and Wildlife, but it's ODA that actually officially validates the notices. So that was it.
Great, thank you, Ellen. Thank you for reminding us about that new program. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. And let's see, we have a question from Carrie. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I'm with Multnomah County Drainage District, and we operate pump stations and provide maintenance to for conveyance and drainage services. And my question is about, or if you could just say a little bit more about that owned and operated component. We own the pump stations, but we don't own pretty much anything else. So it's you know, we might access the system to do maintenance from private property, but we don't own any of that. So I guess just trying to dig in a little bit more on what the operation part, if you have activities in something you don't own, or how that works at a deeper level. Does that make sense?
It does. Okay. I think this is probably one where we could provide a better answer after sitting down with you and getting a better understanding of how your agreements work and operating or maintaining infrastructure that you may not actually own or be responsible for. I think the assumption on our part, and again, this is because we'd reached out for and just didn't get a reply from most people. This represents, I think, a really good example of where we probably don't have a really clear understanding in these types of circumstances, how implementation is occurring. And so, our assumption going into this is that if you're operating it, you have some type of authority or jurisdiction over the, when and how maintenance occurs. But if that's not the case, I think it would probably take that one-on-one discussion with your basin coordinator to kind of get them up to speed and design an implementation plan that reflects any of those nuances that exist. Andrea, did you have anything to add to that? I know that's probably not the answer you're looking for, but it may just require us to dig in a little deeper into your more specific system requirements.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add either. Priscilla, Carrie, you'll be working with me.
So there you go. Andrea's going to have that in-depth conversation with you, Carrie.
Yeah, no, that'll be a good conversation. No, I appreciate that distinction there. So we'll talk more.
Great, thank you.
I think you're on mute, Sarah.
Of course I am. Brent, you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. So mine's a little bit of a follow-up question too. We, as an entity, our district is made up of generally easements that are granted, but even our individual ditches, we manage 114 miles. We have hundreds of separate individually negotiated easements. And so each of those could have legal nuances. And how are we going to wade through that issue? There's, this basic map that we generate, but there are, I guess, a multitude of issues in true implementation.
So generally so you have lots of different easements. Do those easements reflect different best management practices that you're employing, or do you typically apply the same approach to canal maintenance and vegetation maintenance regardless of the easement? Is the easement more specific to access, or is it actually specific to the type of BMPs that you're implementing?
No, it may say things like we're responsible to remove all vegetation from the easement area, or if we're cleaning silts, they needed to be deposited within 10 feet of the ditch edge. Those kinds of very specific realities of operating the system.
That's another question I don't have an easy answer for this morning. Depositing a pile of sediments right on a canal bank is not what DEQ is looking for in implementation. If that's something required of the easement, I realize you have like a legal responsibility to do that. So it sounds like your implementation plan may take extra time to work through if you have a lot of these very specific requirements outlined in easements. And some of them, on the example you gave, sound like they may be in conflict with what the state order is asking you to do.
Yeah, I guess that was part of concern and question is how do we don't even have those completely identified as an entity because they're site by site.
Because they're so specific and they're so many.
And so how do we generalize in our working plan at this point, but build in components where we can fill in that detail as we understand it and you understand it.
Yeah, it sounds like that is going to be a little more complicated than some of the more simple systems that we've already started working for. We'll just take it one step at a time, and we'll start with what DEQ is asking for, and then ask you to let us know where that's inconsistent with easement requirements that you guys are committed to implementing.
I have an additional question if
Mhm.
anyone else.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
And this is related to stormwater. I think many of you are familiar with our system here and some of the history, but how do you plan on identifying, we have our system and facilities mapped, but we don't have county road ditches, city discharges into our system mapped. And is that going to be the responsibility of those municipalities to identify and map where they influence our system? Or do you expect the districts to gather that information?
That is a really good question. The districts that I do have experience working with down in the Rogue, and a couple here in the upper Willamette that I work with, have intergovernmental agreements drawn up with the local city where they work together to outline where those discharges exist and who's responsible for volume when new development goes in or redevelopment goes in. So, I think the expectation would be that the entities that are contributing stormwater to a canal or to a ditch are working together to address that jurisdiction and that issue. I've seen that done very successfully down in the Rogue, and I've seen that work really well between the city of Eugene and the district that they discharge stormwater to. So I think there's some good examples out there of how those two different jurisdictions can work together to arrive at an intergovernmental agreement. But I don't think that is an IGA that DEQ would be directly involved in. That would be something that is pursued and facilitated between those two entities sharing that system. And I know that you've had some issues in the past and have worked with DEQ's permit program. That those are ones that I could speak to specifically today because I'm focused on non-point source. Maybe Zach, you could speak to that. How DEQ's program has coordinated or not coordinated in that type of situation previously.
Yeah, so I guess I can speak to just a couple of things. One is that with all of the facilities that we have that have a NPDES permit, those are all mapped and we have those locations and what they discharge to. Prior to those facilities getting a permit, they're required to let us know what water body they discharge to. So we have all that. We have it all available in GIS. So we have that. And what was the second part of your question, Priscilla?
You may have had to step away a bit.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I completely answered that question, but with regards to permittees, I guess I'll say that. And then maybe I can also just say that with regards to, those permitted facilities and how they meet the requirements of the TMDL, we did analysis in the TMDL of those facilities and determined that if they were meeting the appropriate permit limits or benchmarks that they would be in compliance with the TMDL. So that's how we address those through the modeling that we did.
All right, any other questions or comments? Well, seeing no hands or comments raised, then we'll go ahead and conclude the meeting. Again, on behalf of everybody here at DEQ, I want to thank you all for attending this meeting and thank you for all that you are doing to improve water quality in the Willamette Basin. We will be posting a copy of this recording in a couple days, so stay tuned and have a look at our website. And everybody have a wonderful week. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you.